Last week, I was speaking with a mid-level trade official from a country that's, long been considered a key swing state in global diplomacy. And he had these two folders sitting on his desk. One was really thick, full of documents about a new regional security pact.
Probably the usual stuff, shared values, strategic alignment.
Exactly, all this heavy language, integrated deterrence. And then the other folder was much thinner. It had just a single blueprint inside.
A blueprint for what?
For a cross-border power grid, an ultra-high voltage one, and a timeline for a new high-speed rail link.
That's quite a contrast.
It really was. He looked at the Security Pact folder with this visible exhaustion, like he was just reading a script he'd been forced to memorize.
I can picture that.
But when he opened the blueprint, his whole posture changed. He pointed at this map of a new land-sea corridor and said something that really stuck with me.
What did he say?
He said, "The first folder tells me who my enemies should be. The second folder tells me how my people will have electricity next winter."
Wow. That cuts right to the heart of it.
It does. To him, one was a burden, and the other was what he called a ballast stone of survival.
A ballast stone. That's a great phrase.
And it feels like this captures a huge global shift. For years, the expectation was that by, say, 2026, this ring of encirclement would finally tighten, isolating the East.
The whole de-risk and decouple narrative.
Right. But as this year started, we saw this quiet, almost clinical reversal. Instead of a tightening knot, it was like a cascade of diplomatic clearings.
From Serbia to Laos, you mean?
Yes. Nations weren't just sending New Year's greetings. They were anchoring their entire national futures to a completely different center of gravity.
It's like the world has moved on. While the West is busy polishing its military strategic tools, the missiles, the carrier groups, the verbal IOUs, everyone else has picked up the development toolkit.
They're not looking for ideological conversion. They're looking for physical certainty.
And that contradiction, that's really what we're here to unpack. This idea that one side talks about containment,
while the other side just builds the tracks that bypass the cage. It makes you wonder, is this whole containment idea collapsing because of a lack of will? Or is it because you just can't contain a power that provides the very electricity keeping your supposed allies' lights on?
That tension you just described, that choice between the Security Pact and the power grid blueprint, well, that's the heart of our mission today. We're going to do a deep dive into the tectonic plates of global governance.
Because what we're seeing is a foundational shift, a transition from, let's say, Western rules-based diplomacy to Eastern infrastructure-led development.
And that's redefining what an alliance even is. It's not about values anymore. It's about who can provide tangible public goods, high-speed rail, energy corridors.
So what's the plan for this deep dive? Where do we start?
Well, the core mission is to unpack this contradiction, the shift from ideological global governance, the kind the West championed after the Cold War, to this new era of material, development-focused regional integration.
Powered mainly by Eurasian states.
Exactly. So we'll start by exploring why that post-Cold War Western order failed. Some sources argue it was a terminal failure. Then we'll map out the strategic implications of all this Eurasian physical connectivity, the trains, the pipelines.
How this land power is neutralizing traditional maritime containment.
Precisely. Yeah. And finally, we'll look at how development itself, infrastructure, energy, has become the new metric of global power, the new primary tool for making alliances.
Okay, let's get into it. The crumbling foundation, the liberal international order, the LIO. The material we've looked at makes this incredibly strong claim that it was, and I quote, doomed to fail from the very beginning.
That's a bold claim.
It is, because I think a lot of people, especially Western elites in the 90s, genuinely saw it as the end of history, a universal success that brought peace and prosperity.
And it was certainly framed that way. But the analysis argues that the structure set up after the Soviet Union fell, say from 1990 to 2019, had these fundamental self-destructive flaws baked right in.
It's important to make a distinction here, right? This LIO was different from the U.S.-led order during the Cold War.
Very different. The Cold War system was a bounded and realist order. Its main goal was containment. The U.S. would often sacrifice its liberal ideals.
Right, they'd tolerate dictators, authoritarian allies.
Whenever promoting democracy got in the way of the balance of power, it was pragmatic.
But the post-Cold War LIO just threw all that caution out the window. It became a truly liberal and international project. It tried to apply these universal standards everywhere.
Yes, it prioritized spreading liberal democracy, pushing for hyper-globalization, and delegating authority to these powerful supranational institutions all over the world.
And that's where the problem started.
Exactly. The source material identifies 3 fatal flaws in this universalist design that basically guaranteed it would fall apart. The first one was rooted in the peril of democracy promotion.
The idea that the world would only be stable if every single nation became a liberal democracy?
That was the core belief. It made spreading democracy the paramount goal. But this project turned out to be incredibly difficult and often, frankly, disastrous.
And this is where that ambition runs headfirst into the most powerful political force on the planet: nationalism.
Precisely. Nationalism is all about self-determination, sovereignty, cultural uniqueness. So when the United States, as the only great power, tried to export its own political and economic model
and remake the world in its own image,
it inevitably poisoned its relationships with the major non-liberal powers, most obviously China and Russia.
Because it wasn't just about fighting wars to force regime change in smaller countries.
No, the analysis is clear on this. It was also about these perpetual attempts at peaceful regime change against the big powers. Think about diplomatic pressure, sanctions, funding opposition groups. It was constant.
So how did that actually play out, say, with Russia in the 2000s?
Well, look at NATO and EU expansion. The West saw it as spreading peace and stability. But Moscow saw the West's support for the color revolutions in places like Georgia or Ukraine
as a direct threat, geopolitical encirclement,
and attempts to destabilize them from within. It was seen as an existential threat. And for China, it was similar. Western pressure on its internal governance, while framed in the language of liberal values, was seen by Beijing as a direct challenge to the Communist Party's legitimacy and to China's national sovereignty.
So these countries pushed back hard.
Of course they did, for deep nationalist and realist reasons. They saw the LIO not as an order provider, but as a direct threat. This whole ambitious project of social engineering, of trying to change the domestic politics of other great powers, was just strategically naive. It was guaranteed to create fierce resistance that would undermine the whole system.
Okay, so the quest for ideological conformity created these costly conflicts abroad and this constant resistance from major powers. What was the second fatal flaw?
The second flaw was the clash with sovereignty and identity, and this is really another side of that same coin of nationalism. But this time, it was happening inside the liberal states themselves.
Right, because the LIO, by its nature, required member states to have more porous borders to delegate a lot of their power to international bodies.
Exactly, the EU, the WTO, the IMF. And for a lot of citizens, this felt like a slow, steady surrender of their own national sovereignty.
It's that feeling of lost control, isn't it? That some distant, unelected bureaucrat or some foreign market is now controlling your life, your job, your borders. That's what fueled the backlash.
There's so much evidence for this. The source points directly to Brexit. A huge part of the sentiment driving that was about anti-immigrant views and people being unhappy with the EU's open border policies.
It wasn't just an economic thing. It was this perceived threat to national identity, to social cohesion.
And there was a feedback loop, too. When those democracy promotion efforts failed abroad, in North Africa or the Middle East, they often created huge refugee and migrant flows into Europe and the U.S.
Which just made the nationalist backlash inside those countries even stronger.
It created this vicious cycle. When nationalism clashed with liberalism over these core issues of sovereignty and identity, nationalism almost always proved to be the more powerful political force. It just started eroding the LIO from its democratic core.
Which brings us to the third fatal flaw, the economic engine of the whole thing. The downside of hyper-globalization. This feels like the one that really hit the average person right in the wallet.
Oh, absolutely. Hyper-globalization was this incredibly ambitious policy to minimize all barriers, to global trade, to investment, to capital flows. It was a radical break from the older, more moderate consensus after World War II.
You mean like Bretton Woods, which kind of allowed governments to protect their citizens a bit from the market?
Precisely. That was embedded liberalism. The post-Cold War version, though, aimed to get rid of capital controls completely. Any kind of government intervention was seen as inefficient or harmful.
And the result was huge economic pain for the lower and middle classes inside the liberal states themselves. We're talking factory closures, outsourcing, wages just stagnating for anyone without a college degree, and inequality just soaring.
Yes, and we can put numbers on that. Just look at the manufacturing sectors across the American Rust Belt or parts of the UK.
Huh.
After China joined the WTO in 2001, up until the financial crisis, the U.S. lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs.
And while technology was part of it, the policies of hyper-globalization were the real accelerant.
They were. The rapid movement of capital and production to low-wage countries was the main driver. Trade deficits exploded, and the wealth from this new system got more and more concentrated among a tiny, globally mobile elite.
And those economic consequences directly translated into serious political instability.
Of course. Hyper-globalization created this widespread anger at the LIO among the very people who were supposed to be its biggest supporters. So the public turned on the liberal elites who had benefited from the system.
And they elected leaders who campaigned explicitly against it, like Donald Trump or the people who pushed for Brexit. America first, protectionism.
Exactly. And that public anger was supercharged by the fact that this wide-open financial system was just inherently unstable. It led to one crisis after another, with the 2007-08 global financial crisis being the most devastating. That event, more than anything else, just destroyed the credibility of the people managing the LIO in the public's eyes.
So hyperglobalization created this huge political and economic wound inside the liberal states, but it also did something else. It killed the one thing that was essential for the LIO to even exist: unipolarity. How did the thing that was supposed to unite the world under Western rules end up destroying U.S. dominance?
That is the absolute critical paradox. Unipolarity, this moment where the United States was the only great power, is the necessary condition for a liberal international order. Without any rivals to worry about, the unipole is free to ignore realism and go on these liberal crusades.
But the policies of hyperglobalization—
free trade, open capital flows, outsourcing. They supercharged the growth of other countries. Specifically, it fueled the spectacular rise of China. It turned China into the world's factory and an economic giant with a rapidly growing military.
And the second that economic growth translated into geopolitical power, unipolarity was over.
It was over. You couple that with Russia's resurgence as a determined great power, and the unipolar era came to a definitive end around 2016. The moment multipolarity returned, the whole structure of international relations shifted back towards realism.
Back to security, competition, and balance of power, not ideological conformity.
Exactly. The liberal international order, which is built on this assumption of unchallenged global leadership, was set for collapse. The source basically concludes it was bound to fail no matter who was in office, because the architecture itself was a contradiction.
So if we are moving into a realist system, a world with competing orders, that takes us directly to how this rivalry is playing out. And it's shifting, isn't it? From a maritime ideological fight to one focused on physical Eurasian land power.
This is where we have to bring in the old historical framework of geopolitics. Specifically, the ideas of Halford Mackinder from over a century ago.
Right. Mackinder is the one who laid out how sea powers like Britain and then the U.S. have always thought about global control.
He divided the world into two opposing forces: sea powers and land powers. He defined Afro-Eurasia as the world island, the biggest, most populous, most resource-rich landmass.
And the key to the world island was the heartland, that huge interior part of Eurasia that was historically impossible to get to from the sea.
Yes, and his famous line set the stakes. Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world.
So the strategy for sea powers was always to control Eurasia from the edges, from the coast, and most importantly, keep the big land powers, Russia, China, from teaming up.
For centuries, that strategy worked, because traveling across the vast Eurasian interior was slow, expensive, and difficult. The landmass was vulnerable to being controlled from the sea.
But the first thing that really threatened that maritime dominance wasn't something modern like satellites. It was much older. It was the Intercontinental Railway.
Precisely. Mackinder explicitly warned about this. He saw that transcontinental railways could connect the previously closed heartland of Eurasia. He was terrified of a unified, powerful center emerging, specifically a German-Russian alliance that could control all of Eurasia's resources and population and challenge the sea-based powers.
And that fear is what led to the evolution of the containment strategy, which was later refined by Nicholas Spikeman.
Right. So Spikeman, writing during World War II, came up with the rimland concept. Mackinder was focused on the inaccessible heartland, but Spikeman argued that the rimland, this strip of coastal land that encircles Eurasia, was actually more important for global control.
The rimland being that buffer zone, the European coast, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. where most of the world's people and industry are.
And Spikeman's version of the maxim became strategic gospel. Who controls the Rimland rules Eurasia. Who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world.
And controlling that periphery, the Rimland, became the basis for the entire U.S. Cold War policy of containment against the Soviet Union.
Yes. The goal was to build alliances, NATO, CENTO, CETO, all along that maritime edge, to box the land power in, limit its access to the sea, and stop any single hostile power from dominating the Eurasian landmass.
And this isn't just history, this is still the explicit foundation of U.S. policy discourse. You hear senior policymakers talk about how the U.S. as a virtual island has to follow the old British strategy of divide and rule from the sea to stop any single power from dominating the continent.
Which brings us right to today. Because what we're seeing now is the strategic resurgence of land power that is actively challenging and, well, neutralizing that traditional maritime containment strategy.
Historically, a land power like Russia was kept in check by limiting its access to the sea.
But now, the Eurasian giants, China and Russia, are physically integrating transcontinental trade networks on a scale we've never seen before.
They're building the corridors, high-speed rail, ultra-high-voltage power lines, integrated financial systems. They are connecting the closed heartland by land, going around all the maritime choke points that the sea powers used to control. This is explicitly anti-hegemonic.
It's the ultimate showdown between sea power and land power. But this time, the land powers are actually succeeding in linking up the vast Eurasian continent with concrete and steel. And it's not just theory.
No, look at the logistics.
Right. Sea shipping can carry huge bulk, but these land corridors are becoming incredibly efficient for high-value goods, electronics, energy. A train from Chongqing, China to Duisburg, Germany can get there in 18 days. By sea, it's 40. That's a huge reduction in costs for certain industries.
But wait, doesn't the sea power still have the advantage just because of the sheer volume you can put on a massive container ship versus a train?
That's the classic argument. But the land powers have a two-part response.
Yeah.
First, they are focusing on that high-value, time-sensitive stuff, as you said. But second, and this is more critical, they are integrating energy flows. All the historical efforts by the maritime power to divide Eurasia, like actions against energy infrastructure like Nord Stream, have actually backfired. They've pushed Russia's vast energy resources eastward toward China and helped create this greater Eurasia.
So the cheap Russian gas that used to power German industry now powers Chinese industry, and India and Iran, all rivals of the United States.
The strategic unity of Eurasia that Mackinder feared is being achieved, not through some political ideology, but through physical, permanent infrastructure, pipelines and rail lines.
So the attempt to contain them boomeranged. It actually strengthened the land power axis and created a logistical backbone to bypass the old choke points that U.S. naval power used to guarantee. And the tool they're using to do this is infrastructure-led development.
This is the operational shift. They've put down the military strategic tools and picked up the tools of infrastructure-led development, or ILD. This paradigm is a fundamental break from the past, especially from the neoliberal policies of the Washington Consensus.
Right. That old model before 2008 was all about getting the prices right. Market liberalization, deregulation, privatization.
Minimal state intervention. But the new ILD regime, which we associate with the East, has a completely different imperative. It's about getting the territory right.
It's a return to centralized spatial planning, but with a global scope.
Exactly. The goal isn't just to integrate a national economy, which was the old post-war model in the West. The new ILD privileges cross-border connections. It's about creating these functional, transnational territories.
Industrial parks, logistics hubs, special economic zones.
And they're designed from the ground up to be plugged in to global value chains.
This sounds way more proactive than just letting the market figure it out. It's a full-on industrial policy to generate growth by physically shaping the landscape.
It is absolutely a state-led industrial strategy. And it's driven by what the sources call a powerful global growth coalition.
Which includes nations like China, but also major financial players.
Yes. Multilateral development banks, massive sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf and Asia, huge pension funds. They all see infrastructure as a stable, long-term asset class. They're all committed to export-oriented growth, and they see big connective infrastructure as the essential piece of the puzzle.
And how is this coalition different from, say, traditional Western development finance?
Traditional Western finance usually comes with high conditionality. It focuses on institutional reform, short-term returns. The ILD coalition, on the other hand, operates on a massive scale, and prioritizes speed and physical connectivity above all else.
And the investment data shows this pivot, right?
The data is decisive. Over the last decade, investment has shifted to this large-scale connective infrastructure. About 80% of these are greenfield projects, brand new, built from scratch. And something like 40% of them cost over $1 billion. They're concentrated in electricity, transport, and digital infrastructure.
And the biggest, most ambitious example of this philosophy has to be the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
The BRI is the signature global project of ILD, launched by China in 2013. It aims to build these Sino-centric production and trade networks across Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. It's not just a random collection of projects.
No, it's a fully integrated strategy.
It merges logistics networks, roads, ports, rail with development corridors and special economic zones. It's probably the most geographically expansive and complex example of this new global model.
Can you give us a concrete example of what one of these corridors looks like in practice?
Sure. Take the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. It's a huge multi-decade project. It includes everything from new power plants, which provide that physical certainty we talked about, to highways, fiber optic cables, and modernizing the deep sea port at Gwadar.
So for Pakistan, it means a stable electricity supply, guaranteed trade routes that bypass the Strait of Malacca,
and fast access to China's markets. That tangible benefit guaranteed power and trade is a much stronger geopolitical glue than some vague talk about shared values.
And you see other examples like the corridor from Chongqing down through Laos to Singapore, or the Lamu Port Corridor in Africa. They're all about providing these tangible public goods ports, pipelines, power grids.
Exactly. The whole strategy is about creating predictable conditions for your citizens and for foreign investors. The African Development Bank even said that African countries can basically bypass the slow path of development and jump directly into the global economy by building well-targeted infrastructure. The message is clear. Infrastructure is destiny. It provides the physical certainty that official in your story was talking about.
And if that material security is the new measure of power, then we have to look at the material foundation of the global economy, energy and finance, which brings us to this incredibly provocative idea of a financial pivot from the petrodollar to the electroyuan.
For almost 50 years, the U.S. dollar's global dominance has been propped up by the petrodollar system. It was set up in the 70s, mainly with Saudi Arabia, requiring all oil trade to be settled in U.S. dollars.
That one rule created this constant global demand for the dollar. It let the U.S. run huge trade deficits without its currency collapsing.
It was a brilliant, self-reinforcing system. It was secured by U.S. security guarantees for the big oil producers, and those petrodollars got recycled back into safe U.S. assets, like treasury bonds.
A brilliant system. But you're saying the whole script is flipping now because of the shift to renewables.
Fundamentally, yes. It's flipping because of the massive supply and the plunging cost of renewable energy tech, and China has established just powerful systemic dominance in this sector.
The numbers are pretty staggering. They control something like 80% of the world's solar cell production.
70% of wind turbines. And they're the global leader in lithium-ion batteries. This isn't a niche sector anymore. It's about 10% of China's GDP, and their exports are just exploding.
So that scale gives China this huge leverage to export cheap, green electricity tech all over the world, which destabilizes the old energy regime built on fossil fuels and the dollar. But here's the key question. How does selling a solar panel challenge the dollar in a way that selling oil enforced it?
It's their fundamental economic nature. Oil is a consumable good. Once you burn a barrel, you have to immediately buy another one. That drives perpetual demand for the transaction currency, the U.S. dollar.
And the oil market is volatile, exposed to shocks.
Right. But solar panels and wind turbines,
they're capital goods?
They're capital goods. You make a big upfront investment, but once they're installed, they give you 15 to 20 years of low-cost, domestically produced energy. The country that buys them gets a degree of energy independence. They move away from those volatile dollar-denominated markets. And China is leveraging this huge trade in green tech to push for non-dollar transactions.
Which leads to this conceptual idea of the electroyuan.
The electroyuan represents the potential for the renminbi, the RMB, to become the main settlement currency for this huge new flow of infrastructure and clean energy trade. It's a direct bypass of the dollar-based financial system and, crucially, of U.S. Treasury oversight.
And this isn't just a theory. We're seeing it happen.
We're seeing concrete institutional evidence. Take Saudi Arabia, the historical linchpin of the petrodollar system. It has now institutionalized using the RMB for some of its oil, petrochemical, and infrastructure trade with China.
That's not the end of the dollar, but it's a profound crack in a foundation that has been sacred for decades.
A huge crack. And the agreements with Iran are even more explicit. The China-Iran 25-year, $400 billion cooperation agreement is explicitly structured to have energy exports settled mainly in RMB or through other non-dollar clearing systems.
The goal is obvious, to minimize exposure to U.S. sanctions, which are all tied to the dollar clearing system.
By focusing trade on infrastructure and energy, and then settling those massive state-controlled flows outside the dollar system, they are actively building a parallel trade and financial structure.
So the trajectory seems to be that infrastructural alignment, powered by clean energy tech, is slowly eroding the dollar's traditional power base. The dollar's network effect is still huge, of course.
Nothing else has the capacity and liquidity of U.S. treasuries. Not yet.
But the long-term structural advantages are weakening as these parallel systems gain physical, financial, and strategic depth.
That's the essence of the shift. Financial power is moving from paper currency backed by military might to physical infrastructure backed by industrial production capacity.
Okay, so if the emerging powers are defining this new order through efficient delivery and physical certainty, it really forces us to look inward at the established liberal democracies, because they're struggling to execute the big projects needed to compete. This is what the source material calls the delivery dilemma.
And the dilemma is really acute because it strikes at the very basis of Western governance. The legitimacy of any system, including democracy, rests on two things: procedural fairness, like elections, and performance, the actual delivery of economic growth, services, security.
And we're seeing global dissatisfaction with democracy being strongly linked to economic discontent and this failure to deliver tangible public goods.
The data is really clear on this. Outcomes matter, maybe more than procedure. You see surveys showing trust in government is consistently low in places like the US, UK, France, and Germany. But it's much stronger in high-growth, high-investment authoritarian countries like China and Singapore.
There's a clear relationship. Citizens in societies with better economic performance, or who are seeing rapid improvements in their lives from big state projects, they express more satisfaction with their government, whatever kind it is.
Absolutely. Satisfaction with democracy collapsed in Argentina during its 2001 crisis. It plummeted in Greece and Spain after the 2008 crash. When the economy goes south, or if the government can't even maintain basic infrastructure, public faith can shift really fast from just criticizing leaders to questioning the whole democratic system.
And then they start looking for alternatives that promise fast, tangible results.
Precisely.
So why? Why are established democracies struggling so much to deliver these big infrastructure projects, the new ports, the high-speed rail, the modern power grids, when other powers can do it with such incredible speed and scale?
It comes down to some fundamental internal contradictions in democratic systems. The primary factor is what we call veto players and proceduralism. Democracy is designed to manage competing interests across many levels of government, federal, state, local, but that often results in what some political scientists call a vetocracy,
where policy just gets bogged down in endless layers of procedure, environmental impact studies, dozens of different permits, labyrinthine transparency rules. And these things are all there for good reasons, to prevent harm and ensure fairness, but they create immense drag.
And when the negative impacts of a project noise, traffic, even the shadow from a new building, are concentrated in one local area, you get this intense, not in my backyard, or MBY, opposition. This multi-layered system lets tiny interest groups or even a few neighbors wage these long bureaucratic wars that can stop progress for years.
Which leads right to the second big problem, the legal bottleneck. In really litigious systems like the United States, regulatory compliance gets outsourced to the courts. And courts do not operate on a logic of efficiency.
The inefficiency is staggering. Under laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, in the U.S., almost anyone can sue a developer over some alleged violation. These lawsuits are often used tactically by wealthy neighbors complaining about their view.
And it forces the entire project to get resolved by a judge on a judicial time frame.
Which can hold up critical infrastructure, offshore wind farms, pipelines, rail projects, for a decade or more, until the legal and construction costs just balloon and the whole project becomes financially unviable and gets canceled.
We've seen this happen. The UK's high-speed 2 rail link being massively scaled back after they'd already sunk billions into it, just because of cost overruns and political opposition.
That's a perfect example. And then you have the issue of time horizons and political will. Infrastructure projects take decades to plan and build, but politicians run on 2- or 4-year election cycles.
It's a structural mismatch that discourages any long-term investment.
Absolutely. A politician starting a huge, complex project has to fear that their successor will just take the credit years later when it's done. Or worse, use the cost overruns during planning as a political weapon against them. It takes a sustained political consensus to get these things done, which is almost impossible in our polarized democracies.
And this whole mess feeds into what you could call a vicious cycle of distrust. If people already have a healthy skepticism of government, that skepticism turns toxic when the government consistently fails to deliver visible, tangible public goods.
Right. When the government fails, a bridge collapses, a project gets canceled. Public distrust spikes. And that distrust then makes it even harder for the government to do what's necessary to fix the problem, like raising taxes or streamlining permits.
It's a feedback loop. The government fails, so people conclude the government is incompetent, and then they refuse to empower it to solve problems in the future.
And the consequence is stark. You contrast that with a system of centralized planning that prioritizes speed. China building 25,000 miles of high-speed rail in 12 years. That execution bolsters performance legitimacy. It gives people confidence that the system can improve their lives. Meanwhile, established democracies are struggling just to maintain their old infrastructure, let alone build anything new.
So, when we pull all of these threads together, the ideological collapse, the geopolitics, the finance, the domestic governance, what we're seeing is a fundamental shift. Ideological alignment is being replaced by infrastructural alignment.
Nations are moving away from alliances based on shared values. They're moving toward arrangements that guarantee material security, reliable power, efficient trade routes, cheap energy.
And the emerging world order will be defined by this realist competition. You'll have a thin international layer for things like arms control and global economics,
Operating alongside 2 thick, competing bounded orders, one led by the United States and one led by China.
And in this new multipolar system, the deciding factor for who you align with, who you trade with, and who has global influence.
It's going to increasingly be the country that provides the most reliable physical certainty.